Ah, yes, children. They are full of surprises, aren't they? Little bundles of joy that eventually evolve into angry, self isolating teenagers, and then adults who never live up to their own expectations, spending their days surfing Zillow for houses they can't afford and binge watching the Avengers films for the 40th time. But enough about me. Being a child means discovering who you are in this world. But what if you were destined for more than just Nintendo Switches and a cell phone at age 8? What if you could make a difference in a world torn apart by religious hatred and warfare, or as it's known in historical context, the Crusades? Between the 11th and the 17th centuries, 7 major crusades took place. It was between European Christians who launched a series of attacks against Muslims that by now had control of the Holy Land, the legendary area that roughly made up the Jordan River in the Middle East that flows through the north into the Dead Sea that connects to the Mediterranean Sea. The term Holy Land refers to the state of Israel, located within the region of Palestine, an area that still today is being fought over. In addition to these major military campaigns against the East, the Latin Roman Catholic Church also sanctioned numerous minor crusades against their enemies. These were called the Albanesian Crusades, which were fought between 1208 and 1241, and the Northern Crusades, fought between 1193 and 1290. Thousands of small, intersecting incidents happened in this 7 part crusade, making up a whole of historically important moments. One of the most bizarre, though, involved children from Germany and France, supposedly unarmed, going out to the Holy Land to take it back. This was called the Children's Crusade of 1212. The participants made up tens of thousands of children, from 2 respective movements led by 2 different single individuals. They were Nicholas of Cologne and Stephen of Cloyes. Both were shepherds who believed they had the word of God behind them in their ventures to the Holy Land. Instead of fighting the Muslims, would calmly and non-violently convert them to Catholicism. Nicholas was from the Rhineland in Germany, who led his group across the Alps and into Italy after leaving Cologne in June of 1212. They took the roads of Switzerland, and once they had arrived in Genoa in late August, they went straight to the harbor, as Nicholas had said in his prophecy that the sea would part, giving them access to the bottom of the ocean floor as a path right to the Holy Land. However, upon arrival in Genoa and its harbor, the sea did not split, leaving Nicholas and his near 7,000 followers upset and confused. Some were even thinking that Nicholas had betrayed them and was a fraud. The ones that left Nicholas were pitied by the Genoa authorities and were granted citizenship, which many happily obliged to. Nicholas refused to give up, though, and headed for Pisa, where he met with the Pope Innocent III, who was not impressed with the venture and thus departed the remaining back to their homes and family. Sadly, Nicholas died on his way back to Germany on the Alps. Back home, Nicholas's uprising and guiding of children away from their homes and families struck a deep chord with the villagers of Cologne. They needed to punish someone for this, but since Nicholas had perished, they targeted his father, who was hanged for his son's actions. Nicholas never did see the Holy Land, and no one, including his remaining family, ever saw him again. At the same time, another uprising was starting. Stephen of Cloyes was 12 years old when he attracted his following, stating that he had received a letter from the King of France, Philip II, who in turn received it from Jesus. Stephen got over 30,000 followers, both children and adults, and went to Saint Denis, a commune in the northern suburbs of Paris, France. While there, Stephen supposedly performed miracles, but Philip II was not impressed with a child prodigy of sorts and sent them back home. Like Nicholas, though, Stephen continued onward preaching his sermons. He traveled all around France, promising to lead a charge for Christ to Jerusalem. He took those followers from Vendôme, a sub-prefecture of the Loire-et-Cher in France, and then onward to Marseille. Like Nicholas, this took place in June of 1212. And just like Nicholas as well, many of his followers were disheartened, returning back to their families. Stephen continued on, but historically it is not known what happened to him after leaving Marseille. So now we have the full narrative of the 2 Crusades. Many historians have looked into these 2 events, some dating all the way back to the 17 and 1800s. But historically, what was the Children's Crusade of 1212? Had an actual account of devout Christian children taken a stance against Muslim control of the Holy Land? Or, over time, has it been an embellished account of something smaller that took place? Let's look at the two words of this supposed incident first. Pope Innocent III was the Pope at the time, and like many political figures, didn't take this marching of children too seriously. He did not call for them to take action or sanction their movement, much like he did all the other crusades. As for a crusade to happen, the Pope must sanction it, initiating a response to the opposing force, and thus sending those Christians into battle, or in this case, to crusade. So, if the Pope never sanctioned the Children's Crusade, can you even call it a crusade? In short, the answer is no. So technically, the Children's Crusade was simply a movement fueled by those solely involved, with no involvement from the Church, making it unofficial. So we examined why it couldn't be called a crusade in the technical term. But what about the actual involvement of children, which has also been questioned? Were Nicholas and Stephen really shepherd boys from their respective homelands? Hundreds of people have since tried to fully document the Children's Crusade, with some likely noted researchers being the German historian Gustav Reinhold, who personally specialized in the documentation of the Crusades, as well as Adolf Wass and P. Alfendary, who saw the Crusades as lower-class peoples coming together to fight against the wars that were highly affecting their lives. Alfendary went further to say that children became the focus because they were the purest form of innocence, recognizing their poverty and acting against tyranny. The most famous documentarian of the Children's Crusade comes from a medieval history professor from Rambonne University in Nijmegen in the Netherlands. His name is Peter Reitz. Reitz wrote in 1977 that the Children's Crusade and those involved in it were on the margins of society. Continuing, they have believed it was up to the poor and marginalized people to make up the flag of Christianity after the First Crusade failed. He concludes, like most of his contemporaries and those before him said, that the Crusades were not really children, but poor people. Using the idea, like Wass and Alfendary, that the poor were going against the Crusades, as the poor themselves had everything to lose and nothing to gain from the outcome. But I stress this statement. Why poor people? You can surely distinguish between a poor adult and a poor child. It's not hard to see the difference. Yet, these records I have mentioned never specifically say they were poor children. Poor people, implying adults were also involved, or adults were the prime agitators, with no children actually involved. Maybe the difference lies in how the church sees the poor. No doubt the poor were religious, so their piety can't be questioned, right? A Google search gives us 3 meanings to the word piety. 1. Devoutly religious. 2. Making a hypocritical display of virtue. And 3. Of a hope, sincere but unlikely to be fulfilled. The first 2 definitions make sense in the context of how the church saw the poor. They saw them as devoutly religious and thus loyal to the church, or used virtue, which means to show a higher moral standard, to display a view on the poor that they truly didn't feel. So, when they spoke of the poor, it was hypocritical to what they really thought. Donald Spoto, an American biographer who wrote on St. Francis of Assisi in 2002, made a reference in one of his passages where he says that monks were motivated to call them, meaning the poor, children because poor was, again, pious, but also because the church was embarrassed by their own wealth in contrast to the poor. This again harkens back to the whole hypocritical nature of the church and its virtues. They want to help the poor, but at the same time are embarrassed to be associated with them, and thus talk down to them and think of them as lesser than. They are children in their eyes. Another inquiry comes from William of Andres and Alberic of Troyes-Fontaines. They were contemporary followers of the Crusades, chronicling the events. Age never really plays a role in their studies. However, William and Alberic do mention the word parvuli, which has 2 meanings. First, it was a reference to purity for a social monarcher, while the other spelling, puri, literally translates to children. The meaning, though, is the powerless, which could also mean the poor, as they had no power whatsoever. All of these revisions are purely hypothetical, as is my interpretation of them. But the Children's Crusade lives on in its name and ideas. The idea that children possibly did this is enough to get people invested, sparking future revolutions of the kind, with most recently being in 2018, when Florida school children protested gun violence after a school shooting at Parkland. They demanded stricter gun laws. People called them the Children's Crusade of 2018. Nobody truly knows if any of the children made it to the Holy Land. Many turned back home, either by force or disheartened illusions of the godlike. Some of those who got the farthest were taken back by boat as willing passengers, or sadly sold into slavery and taken to Tunisia, disappearing from history altogether. In the end, it was a disaster. As Joanne Mary Boyce, author of The Departure, an episode of the Children's Crusade 13th Century, notes in one of her final passages, one thing is for sure, that of the many thousands who rose up, only very few returned.